Time is a peculiar construct. We measure history in eras, in dynasties, in wars that span decades. We think of conflict as a long, grinding attrition of mud and blood, where seasons change and years pass while men die in trenches. We are conditioned to believe that the collapse of a nation is a slow, agonizing process. But sometimes, history does not crawl. Sometimes it snaps. Imagine a single lunch break, the time it takes to commute to work, the time it takes to watch one episode of a television show. 38 minutes. In our modern lives, 38 minutes is a gap in the schedule. It is inconsequential. It is a waiting period. But on a humid August morning in 1896, 38 minutes was all it took to dismantle a government. It was all it took to turn a palace into a tomb. It was all it took to end a dynasty and rewrite the fate of an entire region. We often speak of the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the Six-Day War. These names imply a struggle. They imply a contest of wills where the outcome hangs in the balance. What we are about to discuss was not a contest. It was an execution. It holds the official record for the shortest war in recorded human history. Because of this statistical quirk, it is often treated as a piece of trivia, a footnote in a pub quiz, a historical curiosity to be chuckled at. But if you were standing on the shores of Stone Town that morning, there was nothing trivial about it. The air did not smell of trivia, it smelled of cordite and burning cedar. The water in the harbor did not look like a statistics page, it looked like oil and blood. This is the story of a collision between the immovable object of imperial pride and the unstoppable force of modern industrial warfare. This is the story of how an empire asserted its dominance without hesitation, without mercy, and without looking back. Welcome to Forgotten Tales. This is the story of the 38 minutes that shook the world and why the world chose to forget them. Act 1. A world on the brink. To understand the fire, one must first understand the spark, and to understand the spark, one must understand the powder keg that was East Africa in the late 19th century. The year is 1896. The world is in the throes of the scramble for Africa. The great European powers, Britain, Germany, and France, are carving up the continent with ink and ruler, drawing lines through cultures they do not understand and claiming lands they have never seen. At the center of this geopolitical chessboard sat Zanzibar, an island jewel in the Indian Ocean. For centuries it had been a hub of trade, a melting pot of Arab, Persian, Indian, and African influences. It was the gateway to the East African interior. It was wealthy, it was strategic, and it was ostensibly sovereign. But sovereignty in the late 19th century was an illusion for any nation that did not possess ironclad battleships. By 1890, the British Empire had declared Zanzibar a protectorate. This was a polite diplomatic term. In reality, it meant Zanzibar belonged to London. The sultans were allowed to sit on their throne, they were allowed to hold court, they were allowed to keep their titles, but they ruled only by the grace of the British consul. It was a delicate balance, a marionette show where the strings were usually invisible, until the strings were cut. On August 25, 1896, the puppet master lost his puppet. Hamad bin Thuani, a man who had cooperated willingly with the British administration, died suddenly. The official reports whispered of heart failure. The streets of Stone Town whispered of poison. Before the British could appoint a successor, before the telegrams could even reach London, the palace doors were barred. Khalid bin Bargash had made his move. Khalid was the nephew of the late Sultan. He was 29 years old. He was ambitious, nationalist, and tired of bowing to foreign consuls. He did not ask for British permission to take the throne. He simply took it. Within hours, Khalid had seized the palace. He had rallied the palace guard. He had summoned the artillery.
Nearly 3,000 men answered his call. They were not a ragtag mob. They were soldiers, servants, and slaves, armed with muskets, rifles, and swords. They barricaded the narrow streets of Stonetown. They aimed their cannons at the harbor. From the balcony of the Beit al-Hukum, the House of Government, Khalid looked out at the turquoise waters. He saw the British ships anchored there. He saw the might of the Royal Navy. But he did not see a threat. He believed that the British Empire, tangled in bureaucracy and diplomatic niceties, would not fire on a city full of civilians. He believed they would negotiate. He believed they would hesitate. He was wrong. The British diplomat on the ground was Basil Cave. Cave was a man of procedure, but he was also a man of the empire. He saw Khalid's ascension not as a succession, but as a rebellion. Under the treaty signed years prior, no sultan could ascend the throne without British approval. Khalid had not asked. Therefore, in the eyes of Basil Cave, Khalid was not a sultan, he was a usurper. Diplomacy was attempted, notes were exchanged. Cave warned Khalid to step down. Khalid replied that he had no intention of doing so. The wires hummed between Zanzibar and London. The question was simple: do we have authorization to use force? The reply from the Foreign Office was chilling in its brevity. You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's government. Whatever measures necessary. The velvet glove had been removed. The iron fist was revealed. By the evening of August 26, 1896, the pieces were set. In the harbor, the Royal Navy gathered. The cruisers HMS Philomel, HMS Raccoon, and HMS St. George maneuvered into position. They were joined by the gunboat HMS Thrush and the HMS Sparrow. Their guns were not pointed at the sea, they were pointed at the palace. Inside the palace, Khalid was defiant. He surrounded himself with his guards. He consulted his soothsayers. He looked at the wooden hull of his only ship, the HMS Glasgow, a luxury yacht gifted by Queen Victoria herself, now armed and aiming its small cannons back at the British fleet. It was David against Goliath, if David had no sling and Goliath was made of steel. Basil Cave issued a final ultimatum. Khalid bin Barghash had until 9 a.m. the following morning to lower his flag, disband his troops, and walk out of the palace. If the flag was still flying at 9:01, the British would not talk, they would fire. Stonetown fell silent. The sun set over the Indian Ocean. Thousands of people went to sleep not knowing if they would wake up in a city or a ruin. The clock began to tick. Act 2, the 38 minutes that shook the world. The morning of August 27, 1896, dawned bright and hot. The air was heavy with humidity and dread. In the harbor, the British ships sat motionless. Their boilers were stoked. Their crews were at battle stations. The gunners stood ready, eyes fixed on the palace clock tower. On the shore, the scene was chaotic. Supporters of Khalid manned the barricades. They checked their old muskets. They looked up at the stone walls of the palace, believing them to be impenetrable. At 8 a.m., a messenger arrived from the palace. Khalid sent a note to Basil Cave. We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us. It was a sentence written in confidence, a sentence that would become the epitaph of his reign. Basil Cave's reply was polite, cold, and final. We do not wish to open fire, but unless you do as you are told, we certainly shall do so. There was no further communication. 8:30. The English ships cleared for action. 8:59. The silence in the harbor was absolute. The seagulls were the only things moving. Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, commanding the British fleet, checked his pocket watch. He was not man given to dramatics. He was a man of schedules. The ultimatum expired at 9 a.m. 8:59. Inside the palace, the heartbeat of 3,000 defenders must have been deafening. Did they doubt? Did they look at the horizon and pray, or did they truly believe the British were bluffing? 9 a.m. The second hand swept past the 12. The flag of the Sultan still snapped in the wind. 9:01. General Lloyd Matthews, commanding the British forces on land, gave the signal. 9:02. The order was given. Fire. The silence was shattered not by a shout, but the roar of heavy artillery. The HMS Thrush, a gunboat, fired the first shots. The St. George and the Philomel joined the chorus immediately. This was not a warning shot. This was total saturation. High explosive shells slammed into the palace. The structure was built of coral stone and wood. It was designed to impress visitors, not to withstand lyddite shells. The walls did not just crack, they disintegrated.
Huge sections of the palace front were sheared off. Balconies collapsed in clouds of white dust. The ornate wooden pilasters, the intricate carvings, the centuries of history, all turned to splinters in seconds. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. The defenders, 3,000 strong a moment ago, were thrown into a panic. The noise was indescribable. The concussions from the explosions killed men where they stood without a piece of shrapnel touching them. At 9:05 a.m., the Sultan's artillery attempted to return fire. It was a brave, futile gesture. Their shots went wide. Their cannons were old. They were fighting the future with the tools of the past. The British gunners adjusted their aim. With terrifying precision, they silenced the Zanzibari artillery one by one. Then the naval battle began. The Sultan's ship, the HHS Glasgow, opened fire on the HMS St. George. It was a yacht engaging a heavy cruiser. The British return fire was almost pitying in its efficiency. The St. George fired its heavy guns. The shells tore through the Glasgow near the waterline. The yacht shuddered. It began to list. Within moments, the Sultan's navy was sinking. The crew of the Glasgow hoisted the British flag as a sign of surrender, but it was too late to save the ship. The masts disappeared beneath the waves. Back on land, the slaughter continued. The palace was now engulfed in flames. The fire spread to the harem attached to the main building. Sultan Khalid, the man who said the British would not fire, watched his world burn for perhaps 5 minutes. He did not stay to fight. He did not stay to die with his men. According to reports, Khalid fled the palace through a back exit almost as soon as the first shells hit. He left his servants, his guards, and his city to face the wrath of the Royal Navy alone. By 9:20 a.m., the palace was a ruin. The shelling continued. The British were not just destroying a building, they were dismantling a symbol. They were making sure that no one for the next 100 years would dare to question the Union Jack in East Africa. At 9:35 a.m., the shelling slowed. The smoke was so thick it obscured the sun. At 9:40 a.m., the Sultan's flag, which had been flying defiantly atop the burning palace, was shot away. The flagpole snapped. The red flag fell into the rubble. Admiral Rawson saw the flag fall. He gave the order to cease fire. The guns went silent. The echoes rolled away over the ocean. The seagulls began to return. It was 9:40 a.m. The war had lasted 38 minutes. Act 3. The Aftermath. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. In 38 minutes, the center of Stone Town had been reduced to a smoking crater. The Beit al-Hukum was gone. The Sultan's palace was a hollow shell. The human cost was horrific. On the British side, the casualty list was absurdly short. One petty officer aboard the HMS Thrush had been slightly wounded. He would recover. On the Zanzibari side, the scene was a charnel house. 500 men and women lay dead or wounded. That is a rate of casualty that rivals the most intense battles of the First World War, condensed into half an hour. 13 people died for every minute the war lasted. The bodies lay in the streets, buried under the rubble of the palace and floating in the harbor. The fire from the palace threatened to spread to the city's ammunition magazines, risking an explosion that could have leveled the entire town.
British sailors, who minutes ago had been raining death upon the city, now rushed ashore. They became firefighters, they became doctors. It was a jarring shift, the duality of the imperial machine. It could destroy you before breakfast and set up a field hospital for you by lunch. And where was Khalid? The man who caused this destruction was running through the narrow alleys of Stonetown. He did not go to his people, he went to the Germans. He arrived at the German consulate breathless and defeated. The German consul, defying the British, granted him asylum. For weeks, the British camped outside the consulate, waiting for Khalid to step out. He never did. The German Navy eventually smuggled him out of the country, carrying him directly from the consulate to a ship so that his feet never technically touched Zanzibari soil again. He would live in exile for decades, a king without a kingdom, watching from afar as his country transformed. By the afternoon of August 26th, the British had already selected a new sultan. Hamoud bin Muhammad, a man who knew his place, was installed on the throne. He walked through the wreckage of his predecessor's palace to accept the title. He signed every paper put in front of him. He agreed to every British demand. Zanzibar was no longer a protectorate in name only, it was a colony in all but title. The illusion of independence was shattered along with the palace walls. The British Empire did not mourn the dead. They demanded the Zanzibar government pay for the shells used to destroy their own palace. It was a final, humiliating invoice for a war they didn't start, but devastatingly finished. Life in Zanzibar returned to a semblance of normalcy with terrifying speed. The rubble was cleared, the dead were buried, the markets reopened. The world moved on. The newspapers in London reported the victory as a triumph of discipline and firepower. It was celebrated as a quick, clean police action. There were no protests. There was no international outcry. It was just another day in the empire. Act 4. Why history forgot. So why have you never heard of this war? Why in our history books do we spend weeks studying battles that moved borders by a few miles, but we ignore a war that destroyed a government in less time than it takes to bake a cake? Perhaps it is because it lacks the romance of struggle. We like our wars to be contests. We like heroes and villains. We like the idea of the underdog fighting back. The Anglo-Zanzibar War offers none of that. It was a massacre. It was a technological slaughter. It was a demonstration of what happens when a pre-industrial force meets the peak of naval artillery. It's uncomfortable to look at. It exposes the naked reality of colonialism. There was no glory here. There was only the cold arithmetic of power. You have the gunboats, therefore you make the rules. History often forgets the wars that are too easy for the victors. The struggles that end before they truly begin are dismissed as incidents or police actions. But for the 500 people who died that morning, it was not an incident. It was the end of the world. For the people of Zanzibar, it was the day they learned that their sovereignty existed only as long as they remained silent. The shortness of the war is what makes it famous as a piece of trivia, but the shortness is also what makes it tragic. It represents the ultimate efficiency of violence. We tend to measure the severity of a war by its duration. We assume that a short war is a small war, but try telling that to the families of the fallen. In those 38 minutes, the British Empire sent a message to the entire world, a message that resonated from Africa to Asia. Resistance is futile. The response will be swift. The response will be total. It was the peak of gunboat diplomacy. It was the moment when the masks slipped and the world saw the true face of imperial power. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a stopwatch. Final reflection. If you visit the waterfront of Stonetown today, the palace has been rebuilt. The House of Wonders stands tall, a museum to a past that feels ancient. The harbor is peaceful. Tourists take photos of the sunset. Dhow boats sail calmly on the breeze. It is hard to imagine that this serene coastline was once the site of the most intense bombardment in East African history. But if you listen closely to the silence, you might hear the ghost of a ticking clock. 38 minutes. We waste 38 minutes every day. We scroll through our phones, we stare out of windows, we wait in line. But history teaches us that time is relative. 38 minutes is enough time to fall in love. It's enough time to cook a meal. And, as the people of Zanzibar learned on that August morning, it is enough time to lose everything. War does not need years to destroy. It does not need months. It only needs a moment. And when the smoke clears and the ships sail away and the history books condense the tragedy into a single sentence, we are left with the uneasy realization that civilization is fragile, that peace is a porcelain vase sitting on a shaking table, and that sometimes the difference between a nation and a ruin is just 38 minutes.